1 year after the ascension of Baha'u'llah in 1892, the echoes of his name reverberated across the Western world. The Reverend Henry Jessup at the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago made reference to the Baha'i Faith for the first time in an address to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. It was like a signal, the start of a new chapter in the history of the faith, coinciding precisely with the beginning of the ministry of the Master. The next 29 years were to prove tumultuous in every sense, for the world, for the fledgling cause, and for Abdu'l-Baha himself. Not long after the name of the Baha'i Faith was noised abroad, the number of its adherents began to grow. Its admirers were soon estimated to be in the thousands, especially in America. And as its fame spread in the West, pernicious rumors multiplied about Abdu'l-Baha in the East. And the officials of an increasingly unstable Ottoman Empire began to scrutinize his activities with growing unease. Unfortunately, their paranoia was incited by enemies closer to home. While still in mourning for his father, the Master had to contend with the ever more willful and bitter jealousy of his half-brother, Muhammad Ali. But this was also a tumultuous time of hope as well as of anxiety, of expanding horizons as the ripples of the faith spread wide. In 1898, the first group of Western pilgrims reached the prison city of Akka to visit the Master. It was the first time that Baha'is from Europe and America had ever met Abdu'l-Baha in person, and his spiritual impact on them was profound.
This relatively young group, consisting mainly of women from high society, was organised and led by Mrs. Phoebe Hearst, the philanthropist and wife of Senator George Hearst. She was the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the well-known newspaper magnate, and their arrival provoked considerable alarm among the Ottoman authorities. Their apprehensions would finally lead to Abdu'l-Baha's reconfinement within the walls of Akka once more, and would ultimately threaten his very life. But in those heady days at the turn of the century, when the early pilgrims saw the glimmering white stones of the city by the sea for the first time, hope predominated. Amatul-Baha Ruhiya Khanum, the wife of the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, describes what she had heard about those days from her mother, first-hand.
My family were friends, my mother's family, of Mrs. Phoebe Hearst. And Mrs. Hearst heard, I think from Lua Getzinger, about all they knew about the Baha'i Faith in the whole Western world at that time, that there was a prisoner in the prison city, the Turkish prison city of Akka, who held the key to the door of peace, which was about all they knew of Abdu'l-Baha. And my mother said, I believe, and fainted dead away. She knew that this was what at last she had found that she'd been looking for all of her girlhood. And then Mrs. Hearst made up a party to go. They were on their way as a party to go to the prison city of Akka and see this prisoner. So she had a gold ring and a gold locket and a few trinkets. And she wanted to try and sell these so that she could get the money to go to Akka and see Abdu'l-Baha. And Mrs. Hearst heard about this, and she came to my mother and said, May, what's the matter with you? If you want to go to Akka, you could come to Akka with us. And so this is how my mother came on the early pilgrimage, you see.
Mr. Robert Turner, the butler of Mrs. Hearst, distinguished himself by becoming the first African-American to accept the Baha'i Faith. May Bowles recalled the significance of this in her later memoir. On the morning of our arrival, she wrote, after we had refreshed ourselves, the Master summoned us all to him in a long room overlooking the Mediterranean. This was in the house of Abdullah Pasha. He sat in silence, gazing out of the window. Then looking up, he asked if all were present. "Where is Robert?" In a moment, Robert's radiant face appeared in the doorway, and the master rose to greet him, bidding him be seated, and said, "Your Lord loves you. God gave you a black skin and a heart white as snow." Since the master's life was packed with activities, the arrival of the pilgrims, uplifting as it was, added to his many responsibilities. His daily schedule began from early dawn and continued on till midnight. His visits to the sick and poor took place before the family had even risen from bed. By the time he returned home, they were up, his sister, the greatest holy leaf, his wife, and her daughters with their children, and they all said prayers together with him before breakfast. In between the chanting of prayers, tea would be served, and occasionally the children would also recite prayers in the presence of the master. Next, the steady stream of pilgrims would arrive to meet him, to ask him questions and to seek his guidance. This historic photograph shows some who came on pilgrimage during those early years. Lua, her husband, and Edward Getzinger, Ethel Rosenberg, Laura Clifford Barney, Harriet Thornburg are seated in the company of a very young Shoghi Effendi, the future guardian of the Baha'i Faith. Later in the day, the master would spend several hours to meeting with government authorities and people with special requests, as well as more time with the poor and needy. Finally returning home, he would complete his voluminous correspondence into the late hours of the night.
One of the Western believers who visited Akka at this time had a profound impact on the master. He was a young Englishman called Thomas Breakwell, who came to know about the faith through May Bowles in Paris in the summer of 1901. On the third day of his encounter with her, Thomas's yearning to see the master became so intense that he wrote these words to him: "My Lord, I believe. Forgive me. Thy servant Thomas Breakwell." May Bowles immediately forwarded his message to Abdu'l-Baha, and soon afterwards Thomas travelled to Akka himself with a fellow pilgrim. What happened when he was ushered into that large room to meet the master was indescribable. He felt an upliftment of spirit, an absolute confirmation in his soul, and his heart seemed to burst within him with a rush of emotion. He was so moved that he was prompted at that moment to confess all to the master. His management of a cotton factory in America, employing child and slave labor, his ambivalence about the benefits he received from it. Abdu'l-Baha instructed Thomas Breakwell to cable his resignation immediately. He obeyed without a moment's hesitation. Intoxicated by this visit, Breakwell returned to Paris a changed man. He found lodgings in an inexpensive neighborhood and walked everywhere saving money for the teaching work. He became a guiding light in the Paris community and was the first Western Baha'i to make a payment to the Huququllah, the fund established by Baha'u'llah for the right of God. According to May Bowles, he was the very embodiment of the Master's words: "The star of happiness is in every heart. We must remove the veils so that it may shine forth radiantly." Breakwell communicated regularly with the Master's secretary, Dr. Yunis Khan, who conveyed the messages of this dear soul to Abdu'l-Baha in Persian.
Tragically, within a year of his pilgrimage, Thomas Breakwell succumbed to tuberculosis and died. The master knew instantly when it happened. To the surprise of Yunis Khan, he anticipated the news before it even arrived and asked him to translate into English a heart-rending message of love for this radiant being. "O Breakwell, O my dear one, at all times do I call thee to mind. I shall never forget thee. I pray for thee by day and by night. I see thee plain before me, as if in open day. O Breakwell, O my dear one. Another significant visitor during these tumultuous years was Laura Barney, an American Baha'i also residing in Paris. She visited the master in the house of Abdu'l-Baha Pasha several times between 1904 and 1906. It was at a time when his enemies were making it increasingly difficult for Abdu'l-Baha to be in contact with Westerners, and the machinations of Muhammad Ali about his motives were at their height. And during her legendary conversations with him, which took place over lunch during what he called his tired moments at this stressful time, Laura Dreyfus Barney compiled her book, Some Answered Questions. This important collection of Abdu'l-Baha's replies to a range of questions on human evolution, philosophy, and science, as well as on the prophets of God, the soul, and its immortality, was to become a source of great insight and guidance for the increasing numbers of Baha'is in the West. Abdu'l-Baha also addressed many Christian topics during his lunchtime conversations with this highly intelligent as well as inquisitive woman. He often anticipated her questions before she even asked them. But in the early 1900s, Abdu'l-Baha had many preoccupations. Not only were visits by Western believers causing concern, but construction work on the building to enshrine the remains of the Bab was also creating major difficulties for the master. These blessed remains had finally reached the house of Abdu'l-Baha Pasha in 1899, after being secretly hidden and transported from place to place in Persia over the past half-century. The time had now come to befittingly inter them, and the spot chosen for the mausoleum of the Prophet Herald of the Baha'i Faith had been designated by Baha'u'llah himself. He had selected the precise spot on Mount Carmel during a visit to Haifa 1 year prior to his passing in 1891.
The enemies of the faith, emboldened by the unscrupulous governor Jamal Pasha, were claiming that Abdu'l-Baha's true intentions were nefarious. They were accusing him of building a fort on the slopes of Carmel rather than a mausoleum, a stronghold rather than a shrine, a mountain fastness from which to orchestrate an attack on the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. As the rumors swirled about him, Abdu'l-Baha continued his daily routine without the least concern. It was during this anxious period from 1905 on that Abdu'l-Baha wrote the second part of his will and testament, establishing the Universal House of Justice and the Guardianship as twin institutions. In the face of these grave uncertainties, at a time when there was even talk of his being crucified on the desert sands, he never wavered. He continued to work. Eventually, the worst seemed imminent. A ship sent by the Sultan arrived in the Bay of Haifa to apprehend the master. It drifted ominously some distance out to sea, but it never docked. After a while, it was seen inexplicably to turn around, and then, just as inexplicably, it sailed away. The officials who had come to arrest the master had been called back to Constantinople at the very last minute. A coup had erupted in the Ottoman capital, and from that day the standoff between the Sultan and the Young Turks became headline news in multiple journals across the world. Sultan Abdul Hamid was unceremoniously deposed, and as a result of the Young Turks' revolution in 1908, Abdu'l-Baha, along with all religious and political prisoners, was finally released. For the first time in his life since the age of 6, the Persian exile known as Abbas Effendi by the residents of Akka and Haifa the radiant figure called the Master by the Baha'is of both East and West was released from bondage. Abdu'l-Baha was free, but one last assignment remained: the transferal of the remains of the Bab to the mausoleum within the structure he had built on Mount Carmel. That was completed in a moving ceremony on the 21st of March 1909, which coincided with the start of the new Baha'i year.